Canada, the most incredible place on planet Earth. We have maple syrup and hockey, but also culture. Culture is a major part of Canada because we have so many people who live here. We're not based off of just one, but we have many. This is thanks to so many people living here. Because of people from Asia, people from Europe, people from Africa, people from the Middle East, people from everywhere. And all of these people have contributed to making Canada, Canada. But we have to start from the very beginning if we want to see how people specifically from Europe and Asia changed Canada's culture forever. To begin, I'm going to talk about three major cultures that influence Canada. The French, the British, and the Chinese. I'll start with the French. The French have influenced Canada in a variety of ways. One way they have done this is by founding Canada. Jacques Cartier sailed to Canada in 1534. Although the Vikings found Canada first, Jacques Cartier named Canada. The word Canada comes from the Huron Iroquois word Canada, which means village. After him, Samuel Champlain came to Canada and established a colony named New France, and French immigrants began to come to Canada for a new life or for work. The French-Canadian population began to grow and grow, and this allowed French culture to be implemented in Canadian culture. The French did this by befriending the indigenous people and trading goods with them. French people married indigenous people as well, and created a new type of people called the Métis. Here's the flag right there, and that means mixed. The indigenous people also helped the French in wars like the Battle of Seven Oaks, helping build a bigger bond between the French and the indigenous. But then, New France turned into Upper Canada and Lower Canada, controlled by the English and French respectively, after the British took over New France. But the two different areas governed over Canada together and made important decisions together. But the French Canadians wanted a government that was an assembly, a democratic form of government, while the British wanted otherwise. So, the French began fighting the British Upper Canada in the rebellions of 1837 and 1838, led by one Louis-Joseph Papineau, a French-Canadian politician who was all in for responsible government. The fighting stopped, and the Lord Durham Report from Britain in 1840 was asking for Canada to become one united colony. And after Canada agreed they should become one united province, this allowed French and British culture to mix with each other. And now the government turned into a democratic government, but still have a monarchy, a constitutional monarchy. But it only became one after Canada became its own country in 1867. But remember how Canada was split into two separate places? Well, Lower Canada turned into the province of Quebec. Quebec is a big part of Canadian culture because it is the only Canadian province where the majority of people speak Canadian French, not regular French. Oh, that's another thing. They also made a new dialect of French there. And this is also another reason why French is Canada's second language, because the French had so much influence on the beginning of Canada and how Canada first came to be. Quebec isn't also known for that, though. They also brought Catholicism to Canada. However, this changed a lot of stuff. Although it created the cathedrals, the hospitals, and also orphanages, it also caused a lot of people to be mistreated, especially the indigenous people. They caused a bunch of Jesuits to come to Quebec and try to evangelize everyone. And that wasn't so good. Now we talk about the British. The British affected Canadian culture because the British influence is found everywhere in Canada. But how did British influence even get here in the first place? Well, the English first created the settlement of Halifax in 1749. And with the taking of Quebec City, Louisbourg, the British gained more land in Canada, because of course the French are rivals with the British. But with the Treaty of Paris, which made France give up all of its territories in North America, New France became a British colony. English immigrants came to Canada back then for two reasons. One, you were a British loyalist and fled to Upper Canada because the United States has gained independence and the U.S. wants to kill you. or you wanted to come to Canada because of farming purposes and because it's a land of opportunity. English people who came to Canada were suitable as settlers because they were poor in England, and moving to Canada would allow them to have a new life. The British realized there was another side of Canada, the prairies and also British Columbia, and promoted immigration to Canada because they would get a massive workforce and the economy would become larger because most people who came to Canada were unemployed, so they promoted immigration so they can gain workers and gain money. This affected the culture aspect because it allowed different people to come to Canada, European and Asian, and allowed them to create communities in Canada, which allowed diverse cultures to spread around Canada easier. Another way the British influenced Canada is their language. After the British took over New France, this created multiple English-speaking settlements in Canada, and then English became the primary language as the British began colonizing westwards to British Columbia. But English was also used when trading goods to the indigenous peoples, and English started to become the normal language everyone should be able to speak so you can trade or talk to other people, French or indigenous. But trading is a big part of how the British changed Canada through the Hudson's Bay Company. The Hudson's Bay Company began as a British company in Canada that traded beaver pelts for goods and supplies. But also they turned the beaver pelts into hats that were pretty fashionable. They were supplied by the indigenous people and also sold their goods to the indigenous people. But although this strengthened the relations between the indigenous people, it also made the indigenous people rely on the British for supplies and goods. But it was good for the British because the Hudson's Bay Company owned a large area of land west of Upper Canada named Rupert's Land. And Canada bought this land after it became a country. But it did not just give Canada more land then, but Rupert's Land allowed the British back then and now to explore the west side of Canada and build communities there, all thanks to the Hudson's Bay Company. Lastly, we talk about the Chinese immigrants. 50 of the first Chinese immigrants came to Canada with John Mears, and they tried to make a sea otter trading post between Guangzhou and Nootka Sound in BC. And that started a long era of Chinese people coming to Canada. Because Chinese immigrants also came from San Francisco to get on with the gold craze in the Fraser Gold Rush. And they also settled in a place called Barkerville. And that is credited as the first ever Chinese-Canadian community. Soon from there, after all the gold was gone, they just started to settle and got different jobs inside of Canada, like farming and domestic services and whatnot. But then this also led to a lot of racist stuff to happen. Let's say, for example, the head tax, as a $50 tax to any Chinese immigrant that would come into Canada. But then in 1903, that tax went up to $500. And also, because it was so expensive to bring a wife or children to Canada with you, most Chinese men came to Canada as bachelors, or just like with no wives or children. And also, another reason why they came to Canada was the Canadian Pacific Railway. It is like a giant railway that stretches from one part of Canada to the other. And they needed workers, obviously, to build it. So, because there is an abundance of Chinese immigrants in Canada, 15,000 Chinese settlers worked on the BC portion of the CPR, and 600 even died because of it. But although the Chinese were better workers than the white workers, they were paid less, even though they were more efficient. Because of racist stuff like this, many activists began to rise, such as Juan Alexander Cunha. He was an activist in British Columbia, who was born in British Columbia as well, that tried to advocate for Chinese rights, and even more came after him. This affects Canadian culture because it affected how we see Chinese immigrants today, because racism is still such a big part of our history, and we still have to reflect on that. But the real reason why so many Chinese immigrants came to the urban areas like Vancouver and Toronto is because they created Chinatowns there. Although Chinatowns seem so overcrowded, Where are these sound effects coming from? They used to be safe havens for Chinese immigrants because it allowed them to express their culture and also escape the racism. They also imprinted some of their traditions, like the kinship system, the temple, and Chinese theater. These communities and also Chinese and Canadians also helped to adapt to the new Canadian culture by adopting some North American traits in their communities, and certain associations that borrowed models from China that also helped the Chinese communities adapt to the new culture but also avoid racism. This affected Canadian culture because it allowed Chinese culture to spread all across those areas, not only because Chinatowns, but because people of the community. Not only Chinese communities, but also other Asian communities, such as Indian, Filipino, Vietnamese, and many more. In conclusion, many different cultures make up Canada's culture. But not only just the Chinese, the French, and the British, but also the Indians and also other cultures that I can't really name because there's way too many. But again, Canada's culture isn't just one. It is multiple, and Canadian culture cannot exist without these other ones.